ॐ नमो भगवते वासुदेवाय। ॐ नमो भगवते वासुदेवाय। ग्रंथ श्रीमद् भागवतम कैंटो 1 चैप्टर 2 टेक्स्ट 15। यद अनुध्यासिना युक्तः कर्म ग्रंथि निबंधनम् छिन्दन्ति कोविदास्तस्य को न कुर्यात् कथारतिम्। यद अनुध्यासिना युक्तः कर्म ग्रंथि निबंधनम् छिन्दन्ति कोविदास्तस्य को न कुर्यात् कथारतिम्। यदनुध्यासिना युक्तः कर्म ग्रंथि निबंधनम् छिन्दन्ति कोविदास्तस्य को न कुर्यात् कथारतिम्। Would you like to recite? अनुध्यासिना युक्तः कर्म ग्रंथि निबंधनम् छिन्दन्ति कोविदास्तस्य को न कुर्यात् कथारतिम्। यदनुध्यासिना युक्तः कर्म ग्रंथि निबंधनम् छिन्दन्ति कोविदास्तस्य को न कुर्यात् कथारतिम्। वैष्णवीस्। यदनुध्यासिना युक्तः ग्रंथि निबंधनम् छिन्दन्ति कोविदास्तस्य को न कुर्यात् कथारतिम्। वैष्णवीस्। यदनुध्यासिना युक्तः कर्म ग्रंथि निबंधनम् छिन्दन्ति कोविदास्तस्य को न कुर्यात् कथारतिम्। यदनुध्यासिना युक्तः कर्म ग्रंथि निबंधनम् छिन्दन्ति कोविदास्तस्य को न कुर्यात् कथारतिम्। Thank you. So, am I audible? But then, where is the reception? No. Okay. So you need this. If I speak normal, it doesn't catch this. Okay, let us see. It's going to be.
So we can reduce the sound.
Oh, no, the sound is not the problem. I want to write over here.
Oh, okay.
So,
Yeah, bring to the side.
okay, you can keep it. Yat. Can you put on this side if possible? Which? Anudhya. Remembrance. Asina.
Sword.
Being equipped with. Karma. Reactionary work. Granthi. Knot. Nibandhanam. Internet. Chintanti. Cut. Kovidaha. Intelligent. Tasya. Is. Kaha. Who. Na. Not. Kuryat. Shall do. Katha. Messages. Ratim. Attention. Translation and purport by His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada. Translation. With sword in hand, intelligent men cut through the binding knots of reactionary work, karma, by remembering the personality of Godhead. Therefore, who will not pay attention to His message? Purport. The contact of the spiritual spark with material elements creates a knot which must be cut if one wants to be liberated from the actions and reactions of fruitive work. Liberation means freedom from the cycle of reactionary work. This liberation automatically follows for one who constantly remembers the transcendental pastimes of the personality of Godhead. This is because all the activities of the Supreme Lord, His Leela, are transcendental to the modes of material energy. They are all attractive spiritual activities, and therefore, constant association with the spiritual activities of the Supreme Lord gradually spiritualizes the conditioned soul and ultimately severs the knot of material bondage. Liberation from material bondage is therefore a byproduct of devotional service. Attainment of spiritual knowledge is not sufficient to ensure liberation. Such knowledge must be overcoated with devotional service so that ultimately the devotional service alone predominates. Then liberation is made possible. Even the reactionary work of the fruitive workers can lead one to liberation when it is overcoated with devotional service. Karma overcoated with devotional service is called karma yoga. Similarly, empirical knowledge overcoated with devotional service is called jnana yoga. But pure bhakti yoga is independent of such karma and jnana because it alone can not only endow one with liberation from conditional life, but also award one the transcendental loving service of the Lord. Therefore, any sensible man who is above the average man with a poor fund of knowledge must constantly remember the personality of Godhead by hearing about Him, by glorifying Him, by remembering Him and worshipping Him always without cessation. That is the perfect way of devotional service. The Goswamis of Vrindavan, who were authorized by Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu to preach the Bhakti cult, rigidly followed this rule and made immense literatures of transcendental science for our benefit. They have chalked out ways for all classes of men in terms of the different castes and orders of life, in pursuance of the teachings of Srimad Bhagavatam and similar other authoritative scriptures. Om Jnanatimirandhasya Jnananjalishalakaya Chakshurunmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Nama Om Vishnupadaya Krishna Pristhaya Bhutale Shrimate Bhakti Vedanta Swami Iti Namine Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschatya Deshatarine Vancha Kalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhya Evacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shri Vasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Hare Krishna. So I'm grateful to be here with all of you today. It's wonderful to see this beautiful center. It shows how the compassion of the devotees is expanding here as the size of the center also expands. So today we'll discuss on the Srimad Bhagavatam. Now this section 1.2.6 I'll be using this as a blackboard to write and draw certain things to illustrate the points that I'm speaking. So in the entire Srimad Bhagavatam, we have 18 cantos and thousands. 18 cantos, is that right? Okay. So I got it wrong, but I made it as if I was testing that you got whether you will get it that I got it wrong. Whether you will get it that I got it wrong. Okay. So 12 cantos, there are 18 chapters in the Bhagavad Gita, there are 12 cantos and thousands of verses. And yet among all those sections of the Bhagavatam, there are primarily 3 sections or 4 sections that Prabhupada quotes the most from. One is this 1.2, and second is the 3rd canto, Kapila's teachings. Then there is 7th canto, Prahlad's teachings, and there's 11th canto, some verses from the Uddhav Gita. These are what Prabhupada quotes the most. And among all of them, this section, what Srila Prabhupada quotes the most is 1.2.6 to 1.2.22. This has in fact become, Prabhupada gave a series of lectures on this in New Vrindavan, and that has come out as the book Dharma, the way of transcendence. So, not only that, Srila Prabhupada quotes a series of these verses even in his Markine Bhagavad Dharma. So, what is the Markine Bhagavad Dharma? Anyone knows? Yes, Markine means to teach or to preach. So, Prabhupada saw his mission in coming to the West as sharing the Bhagavatam. And actually, Markine Bhagavad Dharma, we all probably have heard the Nachao, Prabhu Nachao se mate. Prabhupada saying to Krishna, make me dance, make me dance. So, that is a Bengali song, but within that, Srila Prabhupada quotes 4 of these verses. They were starting from this particular verse onwards, something like that. So now Prabhupada is composing Bengali, but his conscious Bengali is his native language. At the same time, his consciousness is absorbed in Shastra. And while offering his heart to Krishna in prayer in Bengali, he immediately refers to Shastra. And that indicates to some extent not only where his heart is, but also what he conceives of his mission to be. The verse which is there in the Markine Bhagavad Dharma, before Prabhupada quotes this, is Bhagavatera katha sei tab avatar shune dhira hoya shune jadi bare bar. That the katha of the Bhagavat is non-different from Krishna. And if one understands this, if one hears this regularly, then dhira hoya, a person will become sober. And in one sense, that is what Srila Prabhupada wants. That is the purpose of the Krishna consciousness movement, that everybody becomes sober. You're all intoxicated and infatuated with material illusion. So let's look at, after looking at the significance of this particular section, now let's look at this particular verse. So what is it saying? The key point it is saying is, Yat anudhyasina yuktaha. So remembrance of the Lord, remembrance of Krishna, it is said, it is like a sword. And equipped with this sword, Yat anudhyasina yuktaha. So this is the first line of the verse. Karma granthi nibandhanam. So the second line says that we are all tied by karma, tied by the knots of karma, or tied in the knots of karma, we can say. So, people who say they are not tied by the knot are even more tied by the knot. So we are tied by the knot of karma. Karma granthi nibandhanam chindanti ko vidastasya. So the third line says that this knot cut by the wise. So it is cut by the wise. And therefore the last line is saying, who will not hear about Krishna? Ko na kuryat katharatim. Who will not hear Krishna Katha, we can say. So what is the correlation between these 4 lines in one sense? Essentially, if remembrance is a sword, so let's put it linearly now. Remembrance is a sword that cuts, that in one sense that liberates. Remembrance is a sword that liberates, and that is what the wise do. So the wise liberate themselves from karma through liberation, through remembrance of Krishna. And how can we get the sword of remembrance of Krishna? That is by hearing. How can we remember someone? When we hear about that person. Like, suppose, I remember you regularly, okay, but I don't know who you are. I never heard about you. I never met you. How can you remember me, isn't it? So, and then it is saying, Ratim. Ratim means, who will not have eagerness to hear? So, here it's a very important theme being talked about, that in bhakti, if you consider bhakti as a process, and bhakti will, if the soul is here in the material world, we are here, and here there is Krishna. So, we want to attain Krishna, and in one sense, when we have attained Krishna, we will have natural eagerness. We will have what we call as higher taste. That utkantha. Utkantha means samutkantha, the Bhakti Samud says this. When we go closer and closer to Krishna, we will have natural eagerness to hear about him or taste. But it is saying over here that you can at the start have philosophical or intellectual eagerness. That means we understand with our intelligence why hearing about Krishna is important, and we cultivate that eagerness. So there is eagerness that comes when we actually are attracted to Krishna. But there is eagerness that comes when we understand how this is beneficial for me. So in general, Rupa Goswami says that the practice of bhakti, that it can have 2 levels, or it can have two driving forces. So you can say drivers of bhakti. So when you talk about drivers for bhakti, for the siddhas, for those who are already purified, those who are already realized, then it is preeti. It is they already have love for Krishna. And that is why they are naturally attracted. They are naturally going to practice bhakti. But for the sadhakas, he says it is buddhi. So what will inspire us to practice bhakti is buddhi. And that's why it's important for us to hear. Many of us may have practically also experienced that if we hear regularly, if we hear a powerful class about the remembrance of Krishna, then after that, if we sit down to do japa, we have greater intellectual impetus to focus our mind. Our mind may still wander, but we will have the impetus to bring it back. Otherwise, we'll start thinking, hey, this is just too much hard work. Actually, sometimes we think bringing the mind back is too much hard work. Then we may think, just sitting doing nothing while the mind is wandering, that is also too much hard work. So, it's one thing to say that I can't control the mind and that's difficult. Another thing is, if I can't control my mind, then why should I sit and chant also? So that's why if I finding our chanting becoming boring or mechanical, it is important to hear the glories, not just to hear the glories of the holy name. It's important to hear the glories of the holy name, but to hear the glories of the person whom we are addressing through the holy name. At one level, the holy name and Krishna are non-different. But another level, so in terms of reality, the holy name and Krishna are non-different. But in terms of our experience, we may not feel the same devotion when we hear the holy name as when we see a beautiful picture of Krishna, or as when we hear a sweet pastime of Krishna, or when we understand the glory of Krishna. So therefore, at our stage, so this same verse, yadadudhyasina yukta karma granthi nibandhanam chindanti kovidastasya kona kuryat katha rati. This word is coming right now, but the word will come later, or similar word will come, that when we become purified, Shrutam Sakatha Krishna, Punya Shravana Kirtana, Hrudayantasto Yabhadrani, Vidunoti Surutsatam, Shushruho Saddhadhanasya, Vasudeva Katha, Ruchi. Ruchi and Rati are the similar things. So, that Ruchi, that taste will be developing as we become purified, as we serve devotees, as we hear regularly. But before that, if we just understand how important the remembrance of Krishna is, then that will lead to intellectual eagerness. Intellectual doesn't mean that we have to be intellectuals. See, it just means that we are using our intelligence to understand the importance of something. So, now let's look at this. So, if we look at this, is the whole diagrammatic depiction of the verse. The eagerness for hearing leads to remembrance of Krishna, and that remembrance of Krishna leads to liberation. So, let's try to understand how remembrance is a sword that will lead to liberation. So, before we understand what is liberation, we need to understand its opposite, bondage. Now, when the Britishers came to India to rule India, at that time, they were, you could say, either amazed or appalled at how passive the Indians seemed to be. That, okay, there were the Islamic invaders ruling, and the number of Britishers who were actually in India was 100,000 times the number of Indians who were in India. And still they were controlling. So they felt that Indians have very little political activism. Although eventually the momentum built up. But the point is, when we talk about liberation, there are very different understandings of liberation in the West and in the East. In the East, primarily India, liberation is seen more in spiritual terms. That we need to be liberated from the cycle of birth and death. We need to be liberated from material existence. Whereas in the West, liberation is often termed in political terms. In New York, one of the iconic images is the Statue of Liberty. So there the idea is, we need to be free at the material level. Nobody should be able to control us. And that is important at one level. Certainly the Bhagavad Gita or the yogic texts, they don't recommend tyranny where people don't have basic freedoms and rights. But the point is that somebody may be at the top of the hierarchy as a king who has a lot of freedom and power. Somebody may be at the bottom of the hierarchy. But ultimately, everyone is bound. Nobody is free. It's only a matter of degree of freedoms. So, for example, we may say that if we consider a hierarchy, so at the top of the hierarchy is the king. Now, I'm talking from a political perspective. From the Vedic perspective, we understand the Brahmanas are the highest. But I'd say at the bottom are the slaves. So, in general, the Western tendency for bringing about liberation is to try to minimize the hierarchy as much as possible. So that's why we don't have kings. We certainly don't have kings with lifelong tenure. We have elected heads of state. So the power is decreased. And then at the bottom of the slavery, no, slavery is reprehensible. That should not be there. So we can say that the king, the slave at the bottom of the hierarchy has very little freedom. Okay, the slave can't even choose what they eat, what they do, where they go. They're restricted. On the other hand, we can say the king has a huge amount of freedom. Okay, the king can use the state's resources for attacking another state. He can use it for his own, or their own sense gratification, or for so many things. Now, from the material perspective, the scope of freedom for a king is far greater than that for a slave. But still, both their scopes are limited. There is a, I think, a European saying. It says, at the end of the game of chess, both the pawn and the king go back into the same box. So like that, while the game of life is going on, a slave might be in a terrible situation, a king might be in a powerful situation. But at the end, both go to the same place, whether it is slave or the, where do they go? They go to the grave. They go to the grave. Therefore, we should all become grave. We should all become serious about what really matters in life. So just trying to break this hierarchy or trying to go from the top of bottom of the hierarchy to top of hierarchy, upward mobility is something which is very much stressed on. Now we want to become more and more successful. Of course, now with the recession and everything, this current generation is the first generation in the last 100 years in America which expects to be earning less than what their parents earned. So there's a lot of disappointment with the great American dream. Well, many people have been able to fulfill that dream, but it has not fulfilled the promise that it came with. People have become materially better off. So the point of the Vedic text is that much more important than getting this political freedom. Now, it is not that it is not important, but much more important than that is getting spiritual freedom. Spiritual freedom means we become liberated from the worldly desires that bind us. So, freedom can have very different meanings, again, in the East and in the West. So, in the East, again, I am using East specifically to refer to India. It can refer to China also. But in the East, it is, we talk about free from worldly desires. So, freedom means that we should be free from, say, greed or lust or anger. That is what is the idea of freedom in the East. Now, unfortunately, I don't want to caricature the West, but in the West, it has become, over a period of time, it has become the opposite. It has become free for worldly desires. Not free from worldly desires, free for whatever be my desire, I should be free to fulfill it. Well, okay, what does that mean? That means that, say, if a man starts thinking, okay, I'm a woman, then I should be free to change my gender and become a woman. And everybody should be forced to treat me like, so my freedom means it's force on everyone else. Or there is everything that goes on with it. The idea of freedom is free for worldly desires. And this kind of freedom actually increases the bondage. It doesn't decrease the bondage. Because when we say we are free for worldly desires, I am free to pursue whichever desire I want. But the more I pursue desires, especially if they're lower desires, they bind me, they entangle me. And therefore the end result is that the person is not free. The person says, I want to be free to drink, to smoke, to take drugs, whatever. Okay, you may be free to take a drink. But what happens is, first the drinker takes the drink, then the drink takes the drink, and then the drink takes the drinker. The person becomes bound. Desires multiply, desires intensify, and therefore the person becomes bound. So this being free for worldly desires, especially, now of course, you can say people should be free to buy property, people should be free to take the job that they want. That kind of freedom is fine. But here we're talking about free for, when it becomes worldly desires, soon the desires tend to degenerate downwards. And that leads to problem. Whereas, when free from worldly desires, that is when the bondage decreases and it ultimately gets eliminated. So this is what the Bhagavatam focuses on. That's why the vision about the ultimate purpose of life is very different. So till now I talked about Chindanti. What does freedom from bondage mean? It means karma granthi. Now karma can mean many things. Karma can mean the reactions to our actions, but reactions to our actions also come in two ways. One is every action that we do, we say karma means action leads to reaction. Now reaction can be broadly in two ways. External, where we get some suffering, and this is a serious problem, but actually even bigger problem is the internal, where we get craving. So suffering means some kind of, suppose somebody drinks, they drink a lot and then they get a hangover, and the person has a terrible hangover when he wakes up, and he says to his friend, I knew it was a terrible idea. So the friend says, I was telling you, drinking so much was a terrible idea. He says, no, drinking was a good idea. Waking up was a terrible idea. So the idea is some people think that I can dodge the external consequences. And they think if I can dodge the external consequences, I am clever. But the point is, suffering may get delayed. Suffering may not sometimes come immediately. But when a person indulges in desires, craving comes. And that craving itself is a form of suffering. Because that craving, it keeps a person, do this again, drink again. So that craving again impels one toward the action. Krishna talks about how Arjuna asks, Atha kena prayuktoyam papam charati purusha anichannapi varshneya baladivan yojita. I'm as if forced to do something. As if against my will, I am forced to do something. So, karma can refer to action and karma can refer to reaction also. We all have to do our karma. That means we are referring to karma as action. We all have to endure our karma. That means we all have to tolerate the reactions. So, this whole business of being impelled towards certain actions and then suffering the reactions of those actions, this whole business is karma granthi nibandhanam chindanti. So this is what we are freed from. This is what we should seek to be freed from. So now I'll talk about the last part, which is the most important part. Right? How does remembrance of Krishna act as a sword that pulls us, that frees us, that liberates us? So we could say that if a person is here and say this is some sense object. It may be alcohol, it may be drugs, whatever it is. So it is almost like there is a rope, which is dragging that person. This is the karma granthi. Is the red visible? Okay. This is karma granthi. It is pulling that person toward that sense object again and again and again and again. So now what Krishna is saying is that remembrance of Krishna, or what the Bhagavatam is saying is that remembrance of Krishna is like a sword, and that sword can actually break this. That sword can cut through and break this knots of remembrance, knots of karmic bondage. So how does remembrance do that? Now remembrance of Krishna, basically it does it in many ways, but let's look at it two ways. What does remembrance of Krishna do? It provides us wisdom and it provides us taste. So when we remember Krishna, basically the Bhagavatam says that remembrance of Krishna, it leads to purification. So both of these are actually, we could say, aspects of purification. So when we say we are becoming purified, what does it mean? That our intelligence is becoming stronger and our mind is becoming clearer. So wisdom is associated with the intelligence And taste is associated with the mind. Of course, ultimately the soul has a natural attraction toward Krishna. But right now, our emotions are largely associated with our mind. So, the practice of bhakti does both these things. Later on in the series of verses, it will be said that evam prasanna manaso bhagavad bhakti yogataha Bhagavatam jnanam mukta sangasya jayate vidyate hridaya granthis छिद्यन्ते सर्व संशयः क्षीयन्ते चास्य कर्माणि दृष्टैवात्मनीश्वरे. So vidyate hridaya granthis. So that refers to how the mind's wrong tastes, the attachments largely bind the mind. So you could not put too much in this diagram now. See, basically the soul is here. The soul has a subtle body which connects it to the outer world. Here there is the ego, and then there is the intelligence and the mind. And then here we have the outer world, which is filled with various kinds of temptations. So now, associated with the intelligence, the blemish of the intelligence is doubts, or you can say misconceptions. Ultimately, every doubt is a misconception. So we have doubts, and with the mind there are desires, and these two delude the soul. The desires of the mind and the doubts of the intelligence, they both cause the delusion. And what is being said in this verse is, or what is said in this sequence of verses is that both of these get removed. So the chidyante sarva samshayaha, by the practice of bhakti, what happens is these doubts get removed. And vidyate hridaya granthis chidyante sarva samshaya. So hridaya granthi is the knot of desire. Asha pashashatair baddha. Desire is like a shackle. So both the desires and the doubts that trap the soul, they are removed by the practice of bhakti. Now how does that happen? How does the practice of bhakti give us wisdom for the intelligence and higher taste for the mind? Now just when we practice bhakti, in the process of bhakti we hear wisdom, we associate with those with our wise, and that itself nourishes our intelligence. So the activity of hearing, it leads a lot of things, the whole limbs of bhakti, but within bhakti there is philosophy. And that is why those who say that bhaktas are sentimental, they are a little bit misunderstanding the situation. Because we can say, normally what people say, if you consider a hierarchy, see, emotion is below. Or you can say people who are emotional are quite sentimental, they say. So at the bottom of the hierarchy is emotion. Then above that is reason. And people say that bhaktas are over here. This is the conception that bhaktas are here. And they say that jnanis are here. Jnanis use reason. But this idea is wrong. There could be some people who are practicing bhakti sentimentally. But bhakti is actually reason plus emotion. It is with our intelligence we understand that it is Krishna who is the supremely attractive object. It is Krishna who is the tattva. In this particular series of verses, vadanti tat tattva vidas. Those who are tattva, those who are knowers of the truth, those people, what do is, they direct their devotion towards the Lord. So bhakti is not, bhaktas are actually here. Aham sarvasya prabhavo mattaha sarvam pravartate iti matva bhajante maam buddha bhava samanvita. They are buddha, they are enlightened. So directing our devotion towards Krishna, directing our hearts towards Krishna is a sign of intelligence. So bhakti, just hearing the wisdom of bhakti, what it helps us to do is, bhakti gives us clarity about what really matters. There are so many things which matter in life, but what really matters in life, what is truly important, that is what the philosophy of bhakti helps us to do. When Parikshit Maharaj is cursed, he just renounces the word. Yeah, this is not what really matters. It's important. While he was in that ashram, as a grahastha, as a king, he was doing his duty diligently. He went and fought against Kali. He was not just reactive, he was proactive. He was doing his responsibility diligently. But then, when the curse came, what really matters is remembrance of Krishna. So, at an intellectual level, we get clarity about what really matters. But along with that, the second thing that happens is, we get purity to love what really matters. So we may understand what really matters, but we may not be attracted towards it. But as we become purified, that will happen. As you keep practicing bhakti. So first we get clarity about this is what really is important. Everything else in this world is temporary. Everything else in this world, not only temporary, the more I pursue it, the more I'll become entangled. The pursuit of happiness is often the cause of the greatest unhappiness. Somebody who pursues happiness through drinks, through drugs, through smoking, what happens is they get that very pursuit makes them miserable. So what really matters? First there's intellectual clarity, and then our heart itself will become directed toward Krishna. And when that happens, then it is prasidati. One becomes joyful, one becomes happy. And that was what this series of verses started with. At savai pumsaham paro dharmo yato bhakti radhokshaje ahaituki apratihata yayatma suprasidati. Suprasidati. That joy, if you feel that joy is not coming right now, that is because right now our mind is not yet attracted sufficiently toward Krishna. At least, but that does not mean we think the process is not working. If our intelligence itself is convinced that yes, this is what is important, then we are growing in spiritual life. Sometimes we may feel that, oh, I've been practicing bhakti for so many years, but still the same old desires keep coming up. I still getting angry. I still feel those cravings. So am I actually growing spiritually? Well, yes, we are growing. The very fact that we are asking this question, that, oh, why are these desires coming? Why are they not going away? That itself indicates growth. I saw an advertisement. It was like for some kind of moped bike. It said, "Discover the beast within you." Now, many people think that bringing out the Rajoguna, bringing out Rajas and Tamas is actually a good thing. Become more passionate, become more, have more and more desires. But what has happened for us is, at least we're not doing that. So we often think of purification only in terms of change of desires. Purification as change of elevation of desires, we can say. This is what we think of as purification. And that is true. But that is only one lane of purification. Another lane of purification is also, and this happens much faster, it is elevation of values. That what we value has changed. And that is why when the desire is coming, I am not welcoming it. I am not seeking it. I am not welcoming it. I am resisting it. I am trying to remove it. So this itself is a sign of purification. And if we keep persisting this elevation of, so if we focus towards a change of desires, well, that takes a long time. And each of us has different levels of conditionings. So based on the kind of conditionings we have, some of us may take more time than others. Now we all have baggage from our past lives. Now some of us have carry-on baggage, some of us have check-in baggage. So people with carry-on can go fast, people with check-in will have to wait some time. But everybody can come out. So we just have to wait for some time. We have to be patient. But elevation of values means that what we are trying to do is, we are trying to resist. Sorry. When there is elevation of desires, that means we are essentially trying to resist and transcend. We are trying to resist, transcend is not a relevant word, it's replace. We are trying to replace lower desires with higher desires. That is elevation. But if elevation is not happening, then we will be inviting and welcoming lower desires. So if that is not happening, then this very change is an indication that the process of bhakti is working. So to see our spiritual advancement, we focus on whether our values are changing, even if our desires may not be changing. Change of values is an indication that we are growing spiritually. And if we persist with striving to cultivate higher values, then gradually our desires will also change. And that is the time when bhakti will become blissful for us. Now also we experience some bliss, but when our mind is not really opposing us too much in bhakti, then we can focus on Krishna and we can relish Krishna. But when the mind is opposing us in bhakti, then we can't relish Krishna. It's like a mother wants to give a child some delicious sweet rice, but the child thinks, oh, this is a bitter medicine. And the mother is giving the sweet rice. No, the child is shaking his head. And all the sweet rice is going here, there, everywhere. But some little sweet rice goes into the mouth. Hey, this is not bad. It's not bad. And then slowly, the child just becomes completely emotional. Give me more, give me more. It is like that. So right now, our mind is thinking, there are so many enjoyable things. Our mind is like the child. And our intelligence is meant to be like the mother. So the mind says, oh, I have to think of this, I have to work on this, I have this, so many things are important. So I have so many things which are important, and focusing on Krishna, no, really, nothing, it's not important, it's not pleasurable, it's not enjoyable. But somehow, with all this restlessness of the mind, we focus a little on Krishna. I say, hey, this is not bad. I feel so peaceful, I feel so good. And then as the mind experiences the peace and the bliss that comes from bhakti, the mind starts becoming calmer. Prashanta manasam yenam. That the mind becomes peaceful. And that is when we can start relishing bhakti. So that stage will come for all of us. We just need to be persistent in our practices. So I'll summarize what I discussed today. The first point I discussed was the significance of this section in the Bhagavatam. Then the second point we discussed was that yadantha karma branthini mani chindanti kovidastasya kona kuryat katharatim. That was the verse we discussed. So it is saying that sword of remembrance will lead to liberation. Therefore, the wise therefore use the sword of remembrance. So why will somebody not be eager to hear of Krishna? So we talked about eagerness in two categories. Eagerness as natural, and the other is, you want to remember? Intellectual, based on understanding with our intelligence. Why we should be hearing that? It is like a sword which will purify us. The third we discussed about liberation, the Western and Eastern conception. In the East it is, in the West it is political. That we need to get more freedom, more rights to do things, which is okay, but that is not going to lead to any ultimate solution. In the East it is spiritual. We become freed from karma. And then we discussed about what is, in this connection, we discussed, how karma binds us. In the West, so karma binds us through not just external, but internal consequences. So the freedom that is pursued in the West, if it becomes indiscriminate, then it becomes, people are free for worldly desires, but they're never free, they become more and more bound. And then so, when we talked about liberation, I talked about how does the remembrance of Krishna act as a sword that liberates? That it, just by remembering Krishna, our buddhi gets, we get clarity of the intelligence. Our buddhi is nourished. We get wisdom. And then what happens to our mana, our mind? It gets taste. So when both of these happen, then we become joyfully absorbed in Krishna. So at our stage, the last point is focus on change. We all want to see change by the practice of bhakti. But what is the focus of change? It should be values. Not so much desire. Desires will happen later. So we focus on the change of values, and that way we can stay confident that our practice of bhakti is working. And then that confidence will be vindicated when the mind also sees, hey, this is nice, this is joyful. Then we will become susukham kartum avve. We will become joyfully absorbed in bhakti. Thank you very much. Hare Krishna. So are there any questions? We have time for questions now? Okay. Are there any questions? Yes. Okay, how can we ensure that we are growing in bhakti? Sometimes what may happen is that we have our bhakti practice. It is not, what you are saying is there's not much detachment, real detachment. We are still attached. If this is happening, and on the other side, what is also happening is that there's only sentimental attachment, we can say. Well, this is a progressive stage, that we just need to keep practicing bhakti, because things are a little complicated with respect to detachment. See, there are 6 opulences of Krishna, and in one sense these 6 opulences are also present in human beings as a result of past karma. So somebody has great looks. Why are some people more good looking than others? That is their past good karma. Similarly, some people are born in very wealthy families. Some people are born in poor families. So when they have it because of their good karma. So now the point is that when we talk about one of the 6 opulences is vairagya, is renunciation or detachment. Now when detachment is present in someone, what is its source? Is it coming from past karma, or is it coming from present bhakti? It could be, of course. What do you think is the answer to this? When somebody is practicing bhakti and they become very detached. So has their detachment come from past karma or present bhakti? Yeah, the safest answer is both. Yeah. What do you mean by past karma? Just like by past karma, some people may have the karma by which they are wealthy. Like that, some people by their karma itself, they are very uninterested in material things from the past. Now, it could be because of their spiritual practices, but it not be because of spiritual practices. Like one of the results of good karma is that one is not dependent, one is not craving for so many worldly things. So when we see somebody, say, becoming very detached, and sometimes we feel, oh, why am I not becoming detached? Why am I still so attached? Well, we don't really know whether the detachment has come because of their present serious practice of bhakti or because of past karma. Now, that does not mean you start judging. You're not a serious devotee. You're just fortunate enough to have some good karma from the past. That is not the attitude we have. But the point is, we shouldn't focus too much on detachment as the key parameter for evaluating spiritual advancement. Because detachment can come to different people at different degrees. And So, what is more important is attachment to Krishna. And when we talk about this attachment to Krishna, or we talk about devotion, devotion can be seen in terms of emotion. That sometimes when I come in front of the Lord and have darshan, I feel such a sweet feeling. Sometimes when I hear about Krishna, I feel so good. Sometimes when I chant, sometimes I feel I want to chant more and more. But then sometimes, we take out the beads from the bead bag. Are there 108 or 1008 beads over here? This is just not getting over. So, again, when we focus on devotion only in terms of emotion, it's important. But Prabhupada focused on devotion. Okay, this is not as important as devotion in terms of dedication. Although there were times when Prabhupada went into ecstasy and Prabhupada had tears and Prabhupada just got transported to another realm because of his divine emotions. But Prabhupada's focus was much more on dedication. So we focus on that. And whether sometimes I feel it's a sentimental attraction or not, doesn't matter. More important is if I steadily dedicated to the practice of bhakti, steadily dedicated to the service of Krishna, then we will keep growing. Okay. Thank you. Hare Krishna. Any other questions? Yes. Yeah, of course. See, when is Western liberation not liberation at all? There are three modes: Sattva-guna, Rajoguna, Tamoguna. So, if you look at the values on which the American Constitution is founded, it is equality before law, equality for the life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, if we consider when the first Protestants came from Europe to America, they were fleeing from religious persecution. There was a 100-year war between the Catholics and the Protestants, and mostly Protestants who came here because they wanted religious freedom. So, at one level, the aspiration for freedom is not a bad thing. Oh, okay, I should have the freedom, like I said, okay, to choose what kind of job I want to work at. I should have the freedom what kind of house I want to live in. So at a basic level, freedom can be, at the material world also, it can be in Sattva-guna, Rajoguna, Tamoguna. But when there is no clear higher guidance, when there is no clear higher purpose, then the search for freedom, so we could say, there is, we can have freedom in Sattva, in Rajas, and in Tamas. So freedom in Sattva, now I am not going to go into elaborately, but say for example equality before law. That nobody should be considered a criminal just because of they belong to a particular race or they come from a particular nation. That kind of bias should not be there. That is fair enough, that is good, it's required. Now when say freedom in Rajas would be, so the idea that there should be there was discrimination, that is not healthy in terms of the equality before law. That is good, but then you can have in Rajas, it is the pursuit of power. It is a pursuit of power at the cost of other things. So for example, Rajoguna, we pursued industrialization, but at the cost of the environment. So power at, you could say, at all costs or at exorbitant costs. So a king, a Kshatriya will naturally want power and prestige and position, but they do it in a way that does not destroy dharma, that does not destroy their citizens. But tamas would be simply self-destructive indulgence. That person doesn't care whether they are indulging in not. So when the search pursuit for freedom at the material level becomes the freedom, they claim it to be a freedom for self-destructive indulgence. That is when it becomes a problem. So now with respect to smoking, to some extent, yeah, people are free to smoke, but we see that in the last maybe 10 years or so, there's a lot of public shaming associated with public smoking. And that's why you don't see any people smoking in public, at least not in where people are crowded places. So there is some amount of regulation of that has also come about. But yes, if the freedom is, if there's no, there has to be some higher purpose for the pursuit of freedom. This is one of the biggest mistakes. See, freedom is not an end in itself. Freedom is a means to an end. We want to be free, but free for what? If that higher purpose is not taught, is not emphasized, then naturally the mind will gravitate toward lower purposes. And then that freedom will start being misused. So we can say freedom is important, but purpose of freedom is even more important, and you can say it's far more important. So if both of them are there, that is good. That is much better. So for example, when our devotees were in Soviet Russia, when it was under communist rule, there was no freedom, and devotees had to practice bhakti underground. Not just devotees, Christians also were persecuted. They also had to practice Christianity secretly. So having freedom is good, but what is the purpose of freedom? If that knowledge is not there, so Russia became at least Soviet Russia, the Soviet Union became Russia. Russia became liberalized, you can say, and then in some ways people, they were not pursuing material things, but they started pursuing materialistic pleasures more and more, and they didn't rise higher. Now those who wanted to rise higher, they could. Now devotees can practice bhakti openly in most places in Russia. So that freedom is not a bad thing, but without adequate emphasis on the purpose of freedom, then freedom can become a bad thing. Okay? Yes, Manandru. Okay, good question. So is it that when we are hearing Krishna Katha, when we are in Krishna Katha, is it that hearing Tattva will nourish Buddhi? Or yeah, it will bring, and the Leela will actually bring Preeti. Is it that, like we talked about 2 levels of motivation, so is it like that? Well, it's not that simple. Because the Chaitanya Charitamrita says, Siddhanta baliya chitte nakare alas, iha haite Krishna lage sudruda manas. That, oh, this is all philosophy, I don't need it, I just want to love Krishna. Siddhanta baliya chitte, oh, this is all philosophy saying this, nakare alas, don't be lazy. Why? Because iha haite Krishna lage sudruda manas. Because it is by the philosophy that our mind will become fixed on Krishna. Sudruda manas. Now why is that? Because if you consider it this way, hearing. Let's look at it 2 ways. If it is only Leela without Tattva, then what may happen is that it can just become a pious form of entertainment. So there are nowadays, as to some extent, Indian national identity is being reasserted. So there are so many TV series coming about, say, about Shiv Mahapuran, about Hanuman, about this, that. Now to some extent it is good, at least these these themes from our tradition are coming in the cultural imagination of the people. But often there is so much distortion in these depictions, and the people at one moment they may be watching say Ramayana and Jatayu is killed, and they have tears, and we may think when I hear about Jatayu being killed I don't get any tears, but the next moment the Ramayana gets over, and they change the channel and there's a cricket match, and say Virat Kohli gets out on 0, and they also start crying then. So, is there emotion because of attraction towards Krishna, or is it just because they are attached to it? And what it is just their emotionality is very high. So it is anything they are attached to, they get emotions in that direction. So Tattva without Leela can just become a pious form of entertainment. On the other hand, if we have only Leela without Tattva, that can become a pious form of entertainment. The Tattva without Leela. Now, when Jiva Goswami has written a book like the Sandarbhas. Now there is some references to pastimes, but there are no descriptions of pastimes over there. So when Tattva without Leela means, I'm saying that there is no emphasis on the person Krishna. That there is Krishna as a person and there is Krishna as a principle. Principle means he is the highest reality. So if there is no emphasis on Krishna as a person, then it can just become dry intellectual analysis. So it is not unhelpful for bhakti because it is still about Krishna. So in that sense it is helpful, but it is not that helpful. So what we want is a balance of Tattva and Leela. And now what will be that balance for whom? That will vary from person to person. It is not necessary that initially a devotee hears more Leela and more later on more. Initially a devotee hears more Tattva and then later more Leela, or initially Leela and Tattva. Not like that. It is that balance has to be individual. The point is some devotees, for them, the path through the heart to the heart is through the head. And that's why repeatedly they need to be reminded this is what is important. And then that helps them. So we need a balance, but it is an individual balance. It is not that those who hear more Leela are having more attraction towards Krishna. But it is that we shouldn't be avoiding Leela also. It should be what nourishes us the most, we have to find out individually. Prabhupada says in the introduction of the Updeshamrut towards the end that once we come to the mode of goodness, how to advance further will be revealed from within. What he means is that Sattvat Sanjayate Jnanam. As we come towards Sattva Guna, we start getting a better self-understanding. Okay, what actually nourishes me in bhakti? What do I need more? And then we can pursue further. Okay, any of the Matajis have any questions? Okay, yes, bro. How do we avoid the consciousness that I am the body? Well, that's very difficult. And who we are is not as important as whose we are. So we are Krishna's parts and parcels, and we are meant to serve Krishna. So in general, focus on service is much more important than focus on detachment, even detachment from the body. So it is important to philosophically understand that I am not the body, but that is not the focus of our consciousness. That is smartavya satatam Vishnu is smartavyam na jatuchit. Always remember Krishna. It's not saying always remember you are not the body or the soul. No, that is not. It is a philosophical principle to understand that, but in focus in bhakti, it's not so much our identity. Identity is important, but it's much more activity. Now, of course, you can say our activity is determined by our identity. There's no doubt about it. But still, the focus is not who we are. It is, as I said, whose we are means our activities are determined by our relationships. If I'm a parent, then I take care of my children. If I'm a spouse, I consider the interests of my spouse. So certainly in terms of philosophical understanding, we have to be clear what our identity is. But in terms of regular remembrance, it is more on focus of service. We remember our relation. If I understand that I'm American, then I have a duty to the American community. If I'm Indian, then I have a role as an Indian citizen. So actually, we are defined much more by our activities than simply by abstract conception of identity. So just thinking I'm not the body. We know very little about the soul right now. We say, okay, the soul is a part of Krishna. But what more do we know about the soul right now? No, okay, it's Satchidananda. Okay, but that every soul is Satchidananda. So what do we know about the soul right now? Well, it's not much. We'll come to know about it when we become purified and we get Swarupa Siddhi, understand our Swarupa. But till then, it's very difficult to focus on just I am not the body. Our process is not the process of naiti, not the process of negation. So, how can we avoid negation when we don't know the positive so much? But what we do know about the positive is that the soul is a servant of Krishna. Therefore, let's focus on serving Krishna right now. Okay? Thank you very much. Grantraj Srimad Bhagavatam ki, Srila Prabhupada ki, Gaur Bhakta Vrinda ki, Nitai Gaur Premanande. So, much of what I spoke today is from this book. I have written some 27 books, out of which I brought this latest book. This is You Are Not Your Mind, You Are Better. There are 64 reflections on verses from the Bhagavad Gita for managing the mind. So like the simple diagrams I was drawing today, there are each article is 2 pages, accompanied by a diagram and a quick summary of the article, the Gita verse, and some reflection questions. So why is our mind so moody? How can we focus when our feelings are going in the opposite direction? Why does the mind give up some attachments easily and some attachments faster? There are many questions that what exactly is the mind? So questions like these are answered in this book. So this is one book that is available, and these are 64. This is 365 reflections, 365 quotes calendar. This is each quote is inspired by the Bhagavad Gita, one particular verse, and this is say for example, you have mind your own mind before you mind other people's minds. So those who open their mouths before opening their minds end up eating their words. So so there are quotes like this. This is inspired by 1715 in the Bhagavad Gita. We may have to live with pain, but we don't have to live in pain. This is 13.21 in the Bhagavad Gita. So these are quotes inspired by the Bhagavad Gita. If you Google these quotes, it will take you to my website geetadaily.com, where there are an article explaining the quote. But even without that, the quote is self-explanatory. And this is also a very non-intrusive way of sharing spirituality with those who are not spiritually interested. That means you could just keep this calendar. You can give them as a gift, or you could just keep this as a calendar on your workplace desk or in a home reception. And anybody who comes, they look at a few quotes. If something interests them, then that can trigger a spiritual philosophical discussion and further inquiry. So both of these are available. If you want, I can sign them also. Thank you very much.